a meditation of all of our hearts, be acceptable to you, Lord. Good morning, saints.
Good morning.
Why do I call you saints? Can you remember? Come on, why do I call you saints? Kenny does it too. The Apostle Paul, in 4 of his letters, he starts off his greetings to the saints in Ephesus, or greeting to the saints in Thessalonica. What he's talking about is to believers. So if you are believers, Paul would have called you saints. Isn't that a good point? Is there anybody in the congregation who doesn't have an English Bible? Because if you don't have, Shirley and I would like to sponsor you with one. Is there anybody who doesn't have an English Bible? After the service, will you please come to us? You'll be getting a gift from Shirley and I, and it's coming with blessings to you. Now, my theme has always been getting to know your Bible. Please don't put the slides up yet.
No, we don't have them.
And last week, we started off with a bit of physical exercise with Brett, remember? Well, today you're not going to get physical exercise, you're going to get mental exercise. And we're going to look at the books of the Old Testament. We're going to look at them in their right order. And we're going to look at who wrote them. So let's start with our mental exercise. I want us to see if we know the books of the Old Bible. Remember, the Bible is God's inspired word. He wants you to know what's in the Old Testament. It's called the Holy Bible because it's His word. So, He wants you to know that. He wants you to know the content. I once did a course, and one of the questions was, they told us right at the beginning, there is a compulsory question for the examination, so you might as well know what it is now. Wouldn't that be wonderful if you went into exam and you'd been told what the question was going to be? That question was, you had to write down the books of the Holy Bible in the correct order. So we're just going to look at the Old Testament today and see if we know the books of the Old Bible in their order. So I'm going to start, and I'd like you to join in with me if you know them. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings. I'm not hearing anybody joining in with me. 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations. I'm not hearing anybody joining in with me. Ezekiel, Daniel, then there are 12 minor prophets, Hosea, Joel, Amos, and I'll just jump to the last one because nobody's joining in, to Malachi. So, now you're going to ask me, really nicely done. I heard a few over there, 10 out of 10. Now you're going to ask me, why must I know them in the right first of all, when the Bible was formed, these are quite a lot of writings still called the Jewish Bible, the Old Testament. They still use that term occasionally, the Jewish Bible. You know, they kept records in those days. We think we're so good at keeping records. We have typewriters, we have word servers and things like that. They didn't have that. They had scrolls. And they had to write with it like a feather dipped in ink. Something like that. And can you imagine Isaiah with 66 chapters, how long that took him? And he had to get all the scrolls. They found the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1948. And that again proved just how they recorded things. In the book of Ezra, there was opposition to going and rebuilding Jerusalem. They had to look at the archives of King Darius, King Cyrus, and King Artaxerxes to see did they have permission to go and build those walls again. So they kept these records. And it's because of that that I'm able today to tell you who wrote which book. But that I can't repeat off by heart. Okay. But I just wanted to refresh your memory on my theme, which is getting to know your Bible. If you love the Lord, you want to follow His Word. The Bible, the Holy Bible is His Word. So I started off, my very first message was, what does the Bible tell us about heaven? And it told us quite a lot of things. For example, it told us it's where God lives. It told us there are many mansions. It told us it's up there, and so on. Then the second part was, what does it tell us about hell? There was quite a lot, and not very good news. And then about Satan, and it was also worse news. That was my very first message to you. The second message I gave, I handed out a paper to all of you with 20 questions. And I gave you a pencil, and I asked questions like, where do we find the 10 Commandments? And you were able, I gave you the answers, if you didn't know them, so you were able to write it down. That's getting to know your Bible. Now I've got to put my specs on. The third message I delivered was, what is the background to our Bible? How did it come about? We need to know its origin, because we are all following the Bible. We need to know how it came about. So we dealt with that in quite a lot of detail. The next one was the riches of God's grace. And I was able to quote you many passages about what God says of His grace from the Bible. And the next one was the Good Shepherd. Jesus Himself called Himself the Good Shepherd. And we delved into that, so we learned about that part of our Bible. And then last week, or the last time, I asked you, who is this Jesus? And what was interesting is Jesus asked His own disciples that very same question. Can you remember the answer? What did the disciples say when Jesus said, who am I? Well, I'll give you the answer. Some of the disciples didn't have a clue. So what they did is they said, oh, some say you're Elijah. Some say You're John the Baptist, who'd by that time been beheaded. And Jesus had asked the question a second time. In other words, don't tell me what some say. Tell me what you say. One disciple got the answer right. Please, somebody, tell me what that disciple said. Please. I can't hear. I think you got it. He said, Peter answered him, he said, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus responded saying, bless you. This wasn't revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. So, not even he knew that. Not even the disciples knew who Jesus was. Do you know who Jesus was? You're serving him every day. You're coming here to pray to him. So we need to know our Bibles. Now you can put up the slides if you like, Julie.
We don't have them.
Do you have them? You don't have them? Okay. I thought you would have. How many Old Testament books are there?
66.
Old Testament? 39. I've just given you most of them in the right order. So now let's have a look at who wrote these books. Because I think that's quite an important item for us to focus on. But before I say the normal words, which is there are over 40 authors in the Bible, I want to ask you this question. Ezra was described not as an author. In the book of Ezra, you will find he's described as the scribe, the writer down. He writes it down, the scribe. And I think a lot of Paul's letters, he didn't write himself. He had a scribe to write them down. So now we're going to come back to the Old Testament. Who wrote Genesis? Anybody?
Moses.
Well, the first 5 books are attributed to the same author or scribe. Because if you think about it, there's really only one author. Am I correct? That author is God. Because he inspired them what to write. But the normal description is we've got over 40 authors. So the first 5 books of the Bible, the Old Testament, are written by the same person. Anybody know who that person was?
Moses.
Moses. Well done, thank you. Now that's an interesting answer because Moses wasn't alive when Genesis took place. Moses was very much alive in Exodus. And the other interesting fact about that is in Deuteronomy, which is the 5th book, he records his death. So there's been lots of scholars debating how can Moses write about his own death? Well, some people have said, oh, somebody added that afterwards. We don't know who it was. And others have said, why couldn't God have told him what to write, even while he was alive? So he wrote down when he died, just before they went across the Jordan. and he's buried in a place nobody knows. So other than that, those two little queries, it's been accepted that Moses wrote Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The first 5 books, and they have a special name, the Pentateuch. So they call it. Then we come to the next book, which is, anybody? Joshua. After Moses died, what took place? Joshua led the people across the Jordan River, and they entered Canaan, and they took over the land. Lots of battles took place, but God was on their side all the time. So, who do you think wrote Joshua? Joshua himself wrote Joshua. It's quite easy when there's a name attached to a book to decide who wrote it. But it's not always true, unfortunately, as I'm going to show you in a few moments. But Joshua wrote Joshua. The next book is Judges. I have to look at my notes. I don't know these all by heart. Before they had kings, by the way, in Abram's day they were called Hebrews. Then they became called Jewish. Then they became called Israelites. So they went from Hebrews, Jews to Israelites. Today we talk about the Jewish nation of Israel. Where was I? I got to Judges, eh? There's some of these books, now that doesn't have a person's name. Before they had kings, they had judges, like we have a judge in a court. And people would come to them and these judges would make decisions for the people. That was their law and order. And then they complained, because all the pagan tribes around them had kings. So they wanted a king. God said, no, I'm your king. But they went on complaining. God gives us free will. And God then allowed them to have a king. And he even told them who the new king was. Can you tell me who he was? Saul. Thank you. That's true. Saul. But now we come to who wrote that book. Because it doesn't have a name of a person. Well, some of these are traditional. They can't be totally proven. Because they didn't always put their name down. You know, like Jeffrey Archer writes a book, he puts his name on it. A painter paints something, he usually puts his name on it. They didn't always put their names on it. So Judges was written by a very great prophet called Samuel. He wrote more, because the next book after Judges is Ruth. Ruth didn't write that book. She was the one who went back to her mother wanted to go back to her own country after the 2 husbands died, and Ruth went with her. And that book is the line of David. That's why it's in the Bible, because it shows us the line of David, which becomes the line of Jesus. So Samuel wrote the book of Ruth. After Ruth, surprise, surprise, the next book is called 1 Samuel. Samuel wrote that book. He also wrote 2 Samuel. But however, in tradition, and this I've just researched, I've got no evidence, it's just what was given to me in research, is that there are 2 other prophets called Gad and Nathan, and they apparently wrote parts of 2 Samuel. I'm just accepting that as a fact. It doesn't really matter to me, it's the content that matters. So all this learning about the authors is not terribly vital in our following of the Lord, but it's very good to know how we got our Bible. Well, we then come to 1 and 2 Kings. Now there were a lot of kings. And after the 2 tribes split, where 10 tribes became called Israel and 2 tribes became Judah, there's their line of kings and their line of kings. And I'll tell you, the 10 tribes didn't have one single good king. They all turned away from the Lord. On the Judah side, Judah and Benjamin, there were good and bad kings every so often. But the book of Kings describes all those kings. And there was a prophet at the time who wrote those books. His name was Jeremiah. A very, very good prophet when you get to the book of Jeremiah. Then we come to the book of Ezra, after Chronicles, sorry. You get 2 Kings, then you get 1 and 2 Chronicles. And what's interesting is that Chronicles ignores the 10 tribes that broke away after Solomon died and his son wouldn't take away the oppression, so they broke away. So Chronicles is quite interesting because it only really focuses on those 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, and what took place in that event. So it's like a repeat of parts of 1 and 2 Kings. Then we come to the book of Ezra. Now Ezra is described as a scribe, who was also a priest, and it was under Ezra, after the Babylonians had conquered the 2 tribes, taken them off to Babylon. It was under Ezra when they were starting to be allowed to return to Jerusalem. Ezra was a cupbearer, which is a very important official because he's got to drink some of that to make sure it's not poison. And he looked very sad one day, and King Cyrus asked him, "Why are you looking so sad?" And he said, "Because Jerusalem is in ruins, my people." And the story goes on, I'm not going to go through it all, that he's allowed to return. So Ezra wrote the book of Ezra. The very next book is Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah also was one of the exiles and also went back to Jerusalem. But Nehemiah was what I call the action man. He was the one responsible for building those walls. And he wrote the book of Nehemiah. The next one is Esther. Unfortunately, we don't know who wrote that book. But yet, the early forefathers who compiled our Holy Bible decided to put it into the Bible. Probably because she was a Jewish lady. She was a part of, I don't know if it's a harem or a wife of one of the kings, and she was very influential in getting them to agree to allow them to go back to Jerusalem. So the book of Esther is about this lady and the part she played, but we don't know actually who wrote the book. Then we come to Job. Now research shows that Job was actually the very, very first book written. I can't explain why the researchers say that, because you would have think Genesis would have been the first book written by Moses. But it seems to be believed that Job was the very first book written. And unfortunately, we don't know who the author was. Job certainly wasn't the author, that they have proved, but they don't know who actually wrote down that book. God allows all sorts of things to happen to Job. He allows Satan to tempt him. And then we come to Psalm. Now I'm sure most of you know who wrote a lot of the Psalms. Who was that? Pardon? Yes, David, King David wrote a lot of the Psalms. There were two other authors. If you look at go through the book of Psalms, you will see the Song of David, but you will also see there two other names. And so, not all the Psalms were written by David. There were three different authors or scribes who wrote those down. Then we come to Proverbs. I'm going to find my notes. Oh, by the way, was the sons of Korah. Right, now we come to Proverbs. Proverbs is full of very, very good advices in few little verses. Who do you think would have written all that wisdom down? It has to be Solomon. We have a very, very good person over there who knows her Bible. I'm terribly impressed. Maybe you should be standing here, not me. Yes, Solomon wrote the Proverbs. Because remember when he was made king, God asked him what he wanted. And he did the right thing. He said, he didn't ask for riches, he didn't ask for glory, he didn't ask for health, he didn't ask for long life, he asked for wisdom. God gave him wisdom. And he became known for his wisdom. There are a few passages where it's proven how wise he was. When two women fought over a baby was one of them. I'm not going through all of that. But yes, Solomon wrote Proverbs. He also wrote Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. They're not books we often read. I know I once had to do a little course on Song of Songs, and I found it very difficult. It's like a love song between a man and a woman, and they're each doing their little bits. I found it very difficult as a Bible study, the Song of Songs. But Solomon wrote it. There's another guy who wrote part of Proverbs, a guy called Agur, and a king Lemuel. Now we come to what we call the major prophets. The first major prophet is Isaiah. 66 books. So prophetic. If ever somebody asks me to prove why Jesus is the Messiah, I will ask them to go to Isaiah chapter 53, because it gives the story of how Christ is going to be born and what he's going to do. That is an incredible book. And so is chapter 14, but chapter 53 is incredibly important. But Isaiah wrote his own book. Jeremiah, he wrote his own book. But now we come to the book of Lamentations after that. Doesn't have a name. Doesn't have a person's name. Jeremiah the prophet also wrote Lamentations. After that, we come to Ezekiel. He wrote his own book. We come to Daniel, who we all know the story of Daniel in the lion's den and so forth. He wrote his own book. Then we come to what we call the minor prophets. Now, minor doesn't mean they're not important. It just means their books are shorter, and they were only for a shorter period. There are 12 of them. They all have a name. So surprise, surprise, who wrote Hosea? Hosea did. Joel did. Amos wrote. Obadiah, he wrote. Jonah, Micah, Malachi. Before Malachi we have Zechariah. They all wrote their own books. So we finished looking at how they came about, but I thought it might be interesting to know when they were written. I've got to find my notes. There we go. When were these books written? They were written over a period of 1,600 years. A long, long time. God inspiring people for all that time to write down what He wants us to know. And that's why we have a Holy Bible. So the first books by Moses was written in 1400 BC or AD?
BC.
It's got to be before BC. Okay, just a little wake you up. Otherwise I've got to do a Brecht one and make you stand up and raise your hands and swing around. Just to wake you up. Yeah, 1400. Moses wrote that. And then, are you surprised to know that the next books after that were written about 400 years later? Any idea why it is 400 years later? Well, if you think about the land of Canaan, God told Abraham to go, He's going to give him a land that was called Canaan. And he went there. And Isaac was there. And Jacob was there. And then there was a huge famine. And Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. But because of the famine, I imagine many other people also went down to Egypt. And what happened in Egypt over the next 400 years? When they went down, the Pharaoh was very happy and Joseph was alive, and they were very prosperous. But over 400 years, what happened to the Jewish people? They became slaves. Total slaves. That's good. Let's stand up this closer. Total slaves over 400 years. So that's why we have 400 year gap. I'm now not going to go through all the other dates. I don't think they're that important, but I need you to know that the first one is 1400 BC, then it goes to like 1050 BC, and then they get written at various periods over all that time. Until what happens after the Old Testament comes to an end? Another 400 years ago, before Jesus comes. Once the Romans, before the Romans came, once it became another book stopped until we get to the New Testament. There's a the research is done. And then we come to Jesus. I'm going to end off by just saying, I'm thinking about the land of Canaan. I've got to do that first. So Abram came to Canaan. They then left Canaan. And then they went to Moses and they came back to Canaan. And they conquered. And they lived there and they fought each other and blah, blah, blah. And after Solomon died, his son was really bad. And they split. The nation, the 12 tribes split. 10 tribes went north. They called themselves Israel. 2 tribes stayed in the south. They were called Judah. It was Judah and Benjamin. What happened to the 10 tribes? They got conquered by the Assyrians and like disappeared around the world. The Bible says God scattered them around the world. What then happened to Judah? They got conquered by the Babylonians. So they were also taken out of the land of Canaan. So they went into Canaan, they went to Egypt, they came back to Canaan, and then they all left Canaan because they got conquered. And they got scattered all over the shore. And there were Jewish people living in the Holy Land when Jesus was born. But under that point they were under Roman rule. And it was only in about 1930, that people started, the Jews started to come back to the land of Canaan. And in 1948, on May the 15th, the state of Israel was formed. So they're back in the land of Canaan. So we tend sometimes to forget. We think they got there through Moses and Joshua. But we forget that they actually left and came back and left and came back. And today they're there. And what's happening? Most of those states around them want to annihilate them. They don't want them to be there. But we know, if you've read Revelation, we know God is coming, Jesus is coming back to Jerusalem. The Jewish nation will be there, 1/3 of them. They will then accept the Messiah. And then we have this new heaven and this new earth, which is not part of today's story. Okay, so now I'm really finished. I hope that this has been like an eye-opener to some of you. Some of you already know it. Everyone who knows it, you could be standing here. I saw you say something, I saw you say something, I saw you say something. So it looks like there's been a lot of people who do a lot of things about that kind of thing. Raise my voice. I have a song for you.